Welcome to our final program for the year. As the bruising political year of 2011 draws to a close, Labor finds itself still struggling to win the respect of voters and still facing questions over whether to stick with Prime Minister Julia Gillard or replace her in the new year. Leadership changes are never easy, as the fallout from Kevin Rudd is still showing. 20 years ago, another leadership change took place, which altered Australia's course. On the 20th of December 1991, Paul Keating became Prime Minister, replacing Bob Hawke and extending Labor's time in office by a further 4.5 years. The Keating government oversaw significant reforms in Australia, which are still being felt today. And to mark this anniversary, we're joined this week by the former Prime Minister, Paul Keating. Welcome.
Thank you, David.
I'd like to rewind to before you became Prime Minister, your time as Treasurer to Bob Hawke. You clearly had a good relationship with him for a time.
For quite a long time.
Well, what went wrong and why?
Well, Bob gave up the reform business, and in the end he was of little use to me after that. You know, I was prepared to run down whatever political capital we had, that Bob had and the party had, for the reform changes. But once Bob got to the stage of resting on the oars, there was no point in it lasting, like going on any longer.
When did that happen?
Oh, really, from about 1989 onwards.
So for a good 6 years, you had a reforming Prime Minister.
For 6 years, Bob's instincts were good, and for 6 years he and I would see eye to eye on most things. I mean, I had the job as the Treasurer, of course, to wind up the reform agenda and to keep it moving. And you often, you know, the Prime Minister doesn't agree with you on everything. You've got to have their commitment, or try and get his commitment in his case. But, you know, but then it ran out of puff. And 89, 90... 91, you know, there was just no point in hanging around in that structure.
But was there any policy disagreement, or was it simply a lack of energy?
Oh, fundamentally a lack of energy, yep. So I decided that there wasn't any point. The party apparatus wanted Bob and me to go on as a team to essentially oblivion. But when I replaced Bob, we were, from memory, 30% in the news poll and 26% in the Morgan Bulletin poll. So we were kind of done for, had it gone on. And of course I turned that, let's call it 30%, into 45% in 1993. So that was 44.9 primary votes. So it was an enormous renaissance. It was the largest increase in the primary vote of any incumbent government since the war. That wouldn't have happened, I don't believe, if Bob had stayed.
You do claim credit for the reforms during your time as Treasurer, the economic reforms, and they were significant. Things like floating the dollar, for example, being, I guess, the hallmark of those reforms.
Well, there's a great range of them, you know.
But others at the time, involved at the time, have questioned, particularly on that, floating the dollar, whether you had to be convinced of it or whether it was your idea.
Yeah.
In the book on Bob Hawke's time by his wife Blanche Del Pugio.
That's a piece of nonsense, a piece of fiction and rubbish, you know. I tell you, let me make this clear. The first time Bob Hawke ever heard that we should move away from the managed exchange rate to the floating exchange came from me. It was about April or May of 83. From about May of 83, the government had fundamentally decided to move away from the managed system. The rest of it was simply a matter of timing and of getting the system ready for it. The Reserve Bank and the banks themselves, the banking system itself. So, though it hadn't become a cabinet matter, because you couldn't make it a cabinet matter until you're doing it, because of the scale of it, effectively Bob and I had decided we would float. The rest of it was simply a timing thing. You know, we had enthusiastic amateurs like Garneau and Barry Hughes and others pushing.
Well, Ross Garneau, who was working for Bob Hawke at the time, recalls that the Treasury wasn't too keen and you needed some convincing.
No, look, I led the debate on. Fundamentally took the responsibility of making the decision to move away from the managed exchange rate, the float. Once that was made, the inside the core of the government, a sort of a sigh of relief was breathed. You know, the guy downstairs, that was me, had made the decision. If it goes bad, it's his responsibility. In the meantime, we can luxuriate in when we change it. And of course, you know, the stuff that Garno's put around for years are fundamentally just lies. Did the electorate take a lot of convincing on these reforms, that one in particular? I don't think so. I think they didn't quite understand a move from a price-based to a quantity-based system is a kind of sophisticated change. It had huge implications for the economy, of course, but and for wages, competitiveness, for sectors, but that was all to come, you know. When you did finally decide that Bob Hawke had to go, it took you 2 goes to bring him down, but... Well, it's interesting you say that. I mean, I did challenge Bob in July 1991, but in the end Bob collapsed. In the end I was drafted. When Hewson came with the fight back proposal, Bob did not know what to do with it. So he and John Kerrin, who was his new treasurer, flummoxed around in the House of Representatives, and as I said, we ended up at 26% in the bulletin poll and 30% in the news poll. When the Parliament met for the last... Bob brought the Parliament back one day. It was a great mistake on his part. He brought it back one day to deal with a bill outlawing political advertising introduced by then Minister Nick Bolkus. The Parliament met for one day, and I think when the members of the right of the party came to my room, they found it was empty because I intended to resign. And when they walked into my office and they really understood for the first time I was gone after Christmas, that's when fundamentally the draft happened. So I was more or less drafted. But do you acknowledge that you contributed in any way to the problems of the Hawke government? I mean, you are regarded as having been a very successful treasurer during that time, but there were things like the Banana Republic comment, the recession we had to have comment that didn't help the government. Well, the Banana Republic government thing wasn't designed to help anyone but the nation, right? The country. I mean, every now and again, David, you've got to think about the country, right? And... it was about being honest. Well, no, it was about getting the authority from the political system, from the cabinet and the party to make the changes Australia needed. I mean, if they had not been lined up, they wouldn't have been in it. So these are just some of the things you've got to do to garner power to get things done. So, you know, it may not have suited some people in the party and in the government, but frankly that was of no concern to me. On the recession we had to have, well, of course, we broke the back of inflation, and Australia's had now 20 consecutive years of growth from it. So you stand by that? Well, of course it had to happen. Otherwise, the wages system would have exploded again. The problem was it was deeper than it should have been, and that was because the interest rates were hung on for too long. But we were then making an independent reserve bank. It's very hard to have one and then tell them to lower the rates. So you're sort of stuck with the outcome. But look at the results. In the Western world, no country has had 20 consecutive years of growth as we have. We've never had it before. But importantly, an average inflation rate of 2.5%. So, you know, the proof of the pudding was in the eating. And the sort of spin meisters, many of them my enemies, and of course, you know, the press gallery, you sell them a line any day of the week. They've run with this stuff for years and years. Did you always want to become Prime Minister? I mean, you talk about Bob Hawke running out of puff and you had to step in, but did you always want the top job? I was interested in public life from my early adolescence. You know, you've heard me say, perhaps, the one guy I admired in the world was Churchill, the moral clarity and the commitment to outcomes. He was a sort of a wild guy, but then that's the only way to be in this game. So I thought, that's the game he's in, that's the game I want to be in, you know.
It took him a lifetime to become Prime Minister, but you got
I beat him to the punch in that sense.
Well, let's look at when you became Prime Minister and the sort of reforms that we saw under the Keating government. And you mentioned the increase in real wages and the downward pressure on inflation that was set in. A lot of that did have to do with industrial relations reforms, which you oversaw. We had, until then, had a centralised wage fixing system. The Arbitration Commission would decide wage decisions. You moved that to the model of enterprise bargaining.
Yeah.
John Howard then took it a lot further with work choices, focusing on individual contracts.
He took it backwards. That's what happened. I'll come to that.
Okay. And then the Rudd and Gillard governments have now, gone back to a situation where the biggest dispute this year, the Qantas dispute, is now being resolved by the central umpire. It's being arbitrated. Tell us about your model of enterprise bargaining.
Yeah.
Why was that important to introduce?
Well, just remember what it was. It was the first time in 100 years that we'd moved away from the central wage fixing system. I knew that unless we had within-sector wage flexibility and we had the ability to produce productivity by the better operation, the more efficient operation of enterprises, then the prospect of real wage growth, strong real wage growth and new competitiveness wouldn't be there. So Laurie Brereton, who was Minister for Labor in my government, introduced those changes in 1992. Now, what were they? You had employers on one side and you had unions in the collective on the other, and no Commonwealth arbitration, fundamentally. That worked a treat. You know, by 1996, we'd had 5 years of, you can say 4 or 5 years of very moderate wages growth, virtually no industrial disputes. Howard upended it. Why would you upend it? Why would you upend it? Because of his anti-union bias. So the changes which he and Peter Reith introduced robbed the unions of the right to collectively bargain, the employees of the right to collectively bargain. Now, a single employee has no bargaining power against an employer. They only have bargaining power as a collective. So the Howard government tried to remove the collectivisation of bargaining on the union side.
But wasn't this about choice? You could still collectively bargain, but you had the choice for an individual agreement.
Look, once you move, that's all hocus pocus. Once you move away from an individual person has no bargaining power fundamentally, unless they're at the top end of the executive tree, and even then they rarely have. The Liberal Party's had this enormous bias against unionism, and so, of course, they destroyed the central tenet of the Keating reform, which was employers on the one hand and union and members in the collective on the other. So what happened? Then, of course, when Howard got control of the Senate, he really went for the doctor and then tried to destroy the safety net. That was the safety net for the low minimum rates for the low-paid, in the main, working women and young people. So he tried to knock that off, and of course it blew up on him. So, you know, whatever problems we now have, and you notice a lot of employer groups are around now moaning away about the wages system, they were in there with Reith and Howard when they made the fatal mistake of mucking about with the Keating government reforms. You know, and they've had a long time to repent in leisure.
But we do have a situation now where Qantas has really set a bit of an example here that other employers must be looking at in essentially seeking an arbitrated outcome. Are we going to go back to this situation?
Well, I think it's a mistake to go back to arbitrated outcomes. Right? I would have let the managing director of Qantas, Alan Joyce, sit there for a week or 2 weeks. The chances are there would have been no more Alan Joyce. Very good chance. Having taken his airline out, how would he was going to get it back?
You think the shareholders would have moved?
Well, I think the shareholders would have moved, and then the board would have had to do something. And the unions, on the other hand, would have had to do something, and we would have got a bargained outcome. Instead of that, we had the Commonwealth deciding it, which saved Joyce and sort of let the unions off the hook. But in terms of Qantas's long-run viability, maybe I would certainly say the non-arbitrated bargain arrangement would have been better.
Bill Shorten is the new minister now. He is going to oversee a review of the Act in the new year. What should he be doing?
Well, I don't want to tell him what to do, David. I'm 20 years away from it now, except that if the government moves back towards the principles in the legislation of 1992, they know it will work because it proved it would work. And fundamentally, it produced a 2.5% inflation rate for 20 years, broadly. Notwithstanding the chicanery of Howard and Reith and others, it basically produced moderate wage outcome and a low level of industrial disputation. So I think that, there are lessons to be had there. And if we go back to a system of Commonwealth arbitration, where we're not returning to the centralised system that I dismantled, but it's derogating from the strength of the bargaining process.
Superannuation was another of your key reforms, introducing for the first time a compulsory employer superannuation contribution. It began at 3%, it's now gone up to 9%, and the government is planning to take it up to 12% as part of its mining tax reforms. Why was this important for you to see a compulsory superannuation system?
Well, in 1985, I realised that by about 2030, we would have a demographic bulge that the country couldn't afford, that in the end the budget would have trouble maintaining, and that the real living standards of working people would fall. At the same time, we'd had this big contribution from the unions and the ACTU in particular under the Accord of reducing real wages and letting the profit share rise. Because of their compliance and their fidelity to that undertaking, I wanted to leave them with a structural benefit, and that was for working people to have a decent income in retirement. So we started with 1%, or 3% in fact, 1% in the first year, delivered industrially, not politically. We supported it before the Commission, and we got to 3% by took 5 years to get to 3%. We had 66% of the workforce at 3% by 1990. So I said to Bill Kelty and the ACTU, you get to 60-odd% of the workforce, I will legislate for the other 40 that hasn't had it, that can't get it through industrial bargaining, who just can't get it. And then, of course, by that stage, we were going for a second 3%, so that was going to be 6%. And I told Bill that I would legislate for 6%. Now, Bob more or less walked away from that in the budget of 1991, but industrial pressure forced the Cabinet to keep to my earlier commitment to the ACTU. At any rate, when I became Prime Minister at the end of 91, in 1992 I legislated the superannuation guaranteed charge up to 9% of wages, and then by 2002.
The employer groups do complain about some of this, about the compulsory super contribution, that it is going to lead to lower wages. Do they have a point? Well,
for a start, you'll hear some employer groups complain that superannuation is a cost to employers. It's never been a cost to employers. If you take out the Treasury data on this, real unit labour costs fell. In every year, the superannuation guarantee charge rose, and it did because of the enormous pickup in productivity. In fact, you can see it on a graph, the 1%. It looks like a set of stairs on a graph, and beside it are increases in the profit share. The profit share actually rose as the SGC rose. So not only did employers not pay it, they actually had this big war chest of capital in the markets to, reduce the cost of Australian capital. So before superannuation, the cost of capital in Australia was above the OECD average. After the SGC, it came down to well below the OECD average. Employers never paid it. It's always been paid by the employees.
Well, a lot more happened in the Keating years. After the break, we're going to turn to engagement with Asia, native title and the Republic. Welcome back. We're marking the 20th anniversary of the Keating government. We're joined by the former Prime Minister, Paul Keating. In your book, After Words, you write about your meeting with the Queen at Balmoral Castle in 1993.
Yeah.
You said to her that a great number of Australians felt no association with her and no affection for her. You say, I told the Queen as politely and gently as I could that I believed the majority of Australians felt the monarchy was now an anachronism, that it had drifted gently into obsolescence. Can't have been an easy message to deliver.
No, but she knew it was coming, and bravely she listened.
In what sense did she know? Is she briefed about these sort of things?
I think so, yeah. She understood what I was there to say. But I told her that it was not about her personally or her family, and that I would not involve her or her family, and of course I didn't. I've since had sort of messages from the royal family thanking me for the way in which I conducted the debate here. But, you know, the fact is that Australia can only be a great country when it claims its head of state as one of its own. It will forever have that derivativeness about it, while ever our head of state is the Queen of Great Britain, and we share her with 16 other countries. And, by the way, we get around with the British flag in the corner of our flag. I mean, great states do not do these things.
But to say, nearly 20 years ago, that Australians had no affection for the Queen, I mean, how...
No, I said no, some
Australians.
Well, in the Great Migration...
How are you so sure of that?
Well, in the Great Migration program, a lot of people here had no idea about the British or the British monarchy.
But when you look at the recent visit that she made and the overwhelming affection that was on show, do you still think that's the case?
Oh, it's an overwhelming affection for her personally, for her stoicism and for her conscientiousness. You know, I think that's a perfectly reasonable thing to
but not
to
for
recognise.
the institution.
But not for the institution. I mean, let's say, you know, you've got the current Prime Minister, the previous Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, the Prime Minister before him, John Howard, and the Prime Minister before me, Bob Hawke, all believe that Australia should not move to a republic until the current Queen is no longer the Queen. Well, that says a lot about us, for a start.
What does it say?
Well, it says, you know, what a weak outfit we are, fundamentally. I mean, we're not going to take our republic. We're going to wait till the old lady dies or leaves. And, of course, the next day, King Charles and Queen Camilla will be there. And, of course, they'll say, oh, let's give the new bloke a go.
So you clearly don't buy that we should wait for Queen Elizabeth to go, and that could be a while.
No, of course we... And look, you know, when the referendum was on, I don't know, but Prince Philip's reported to have said, don't those people know what's good for them?
You know,
I mean, look, the royal family would have been quite happy to have kissed us goodbye and wished us good luck. And the Queen would have come here, as I said to her at Balmoral, in an even bigger reception as the head of state of Great Britain, rather than a pretend head of state of Australia, and not pretending constitutionally, but pretending in a sort of national sense. And I think the House of Windsor understands that well. It's only the sort of monarchists and drop kicks here who don't get it.
But Labor's been in office for more than 4 years now, and they are Republicans, and we know
they're only half-baked Republicans.
This is the point. Why are they so scared to address the issue?
They don't have the imagination about this. They don't see the importance of the country. The Republic will say much more to us about ourselves than it will ever say to anyone. I mean, you just imagine the impact on this country psychologically of the shift to an Australian person as our head of state. It would have been huge and will be huge. But, you know, if we weakly, and I mean W-E-A-K-L-Y, just sort of take it when no one else sort of wants it, you know, and say, oh, now we're a republic. I mean, George Washington didn't do this with George III, you know. Those Americans knew exactly what they needed.
What do you think it's going to take for this to happen?
Leadership, imagination.
And we don't have that?
On this issue, no.
Another issue that many in Labor regard as one of your greatest legacies was native title. Now, you had to deal with the High Court's Mabo ruling that Australia, this land, was indeed owned by the Indigenous people. You devoted a lot of time and energy to this as Prime Minister. It did cost you politically at the time. Why was it? I mean, you had to deal with the High Court ruling.
Well, I didn't have to. I could have let this been decided by cases. Case law could have decided this. I could have said, well, if the High Court wants to do that, let them decide now when the first claim is made what they want to do with it. See, what the High Court said, there is a native title in the common law of Australia has within it a European title of land, but also a native title. But who has the title, what it is, and how you get it, they were silent. So in other words, they handed me an enormous problem. If I had have said, well, you've made the problem, you solve it, the states of Western Australia and Queensland and others would have simply wiped out native title wholesale. So I moved to set up this great body of property and cultural law to protect native title for the benefit of Indigenous Australians. In other words, once the High Court had made the decision in principle, the facilitation of it in this massive piece of law had to happen, in my view. But it did cost me a year, and it probably cost me a very large part of the electorates of Queensland and Western Australia, at least, in 1996. But, you know, a country gets its advances by victories. It doesn't get its advances by shilly-shallying or sleights of hand. It gets it by victories. So, therefore, these are the things that have to happen. It's a bit like the Republic. I mean, and again, you know, we want to go to Asia and say, here we are, the Australian nation with this new-made economy and its multicultural society. But by the way, we're quite mean to the Indigenes. But we want to be cuddling up to all you other Indigenes in Indonesia, in Vietnam, in China. But to our own Indigenes, we're less than good.
Well, just on that, we used to hear a lot about reconciliation. These days, a lot of the focus, when it comes to Indigenous Australia, is about so-called practical reconciliation, about closing the gap on disadvantage, on tougher welfare measures to treat bad behaviour. The apology was it the last significant act of reconciliation, and is there more work to do on this?
Well, the apology which Kevin Rudd properly made, was to the inquiry that I had established. I established the inquiry into the stolen generation. It was always a matter of wonderment to me why people in Aboriginal Australia wanted Howard to offer the apology when he didn't want to do it, after, in the Redfern speech, I had said it all. You know, I had come clean. You know, I had the phrases. We brought the alcohol and the diseases. We did the murder. We took the children from their families.
So was the Redfern speech an apology?
So, well, it was bigger than an apology. It was the complete commitment to the truth. And so why would they then why would the Aboriginal community run around asking Howard to say these things, which he would never have said, after I'd said them, as Prime Minister of the country? The Prime Minister of Australia had said these things.
But hang on, are you saying there wasn't a need for the actual word sorry, for the apology speech?
Well, what I'm saying, there was a need for the apology speech when Kevin Rudd gave it, because Howard willfully decided never to have a bar of it. But why Aboriginal Australia went chasing from Howard, a Conservative politician who was never going to ever meet these claims, is always beyond me.
But what do you think of the current approach on Indigenous Australia, this tougher welfare measures that we hear about, the focus on closing the gap?
Well, I mean, you know, say yes and yes to those things. I mean, I'm not doing it anymore as I would have. I mean, if I'd have won the election in 1996, I would have sworn myself in as Aboriginal Affairs Minister and done all of this stuff. I mean, got it again, mostly out of the road. You've got to go to the people who want to do the stuff. If you go to the others, it never gets done.
I want to turn to the Asian region. You famously said that Australia had to find its security in Asia, not from Asia. And you were instrumental in making the APEC summit a leaders forum. 20 years on, though, our economic focus has certainly shifted into Asia. But on the security front, I mean, the recent visit from President Obama did seem to show that we are, to some extent, still looking at our security from Asia rather than in Asia. Yeah,
well, Australia can only ever find its security in Asia. It can never find its security from Asia. In the end of 1991, which is 2 years after the Berlin Wall fell, and I was sworn in as Prime Minister 2 weeks after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And so I could see this huge opportunity in the Pacific for open regionalism, of bringing the United States together with countries like China institutionally, to get out of the old bipolarity of the Cold War. States like Vietnam, the states of South Indonesia, the former leader of the non-aligned movement, I could see a construct where you could bring them together. So this is where I thought Australian foreign policy, as a middle power, we could do these things. And we could, frankly, do this better than the Americans were able to do it. And they are very grateful for the fact that we built the first piece of Asia-Pacific political superstructure with the APEC leaders meeting. And it's 20 years old next year. I mean, all those Chinese and American presidents have met one another year in, year out, you know, and often numbers of times during the year for 20 years. This wouldn't have happened.
That dialogue is clearly important between these leaders, but we still obviously have some tension in that US-China relationship, which seems to be getting worse. I mean, President Obama, in his address to the Australian Parliament, talked about making a top priority for his national security team, the US presence and mission in the Asia-Pacific. He said that, quote, "we'll preserve our unique ability to project power and deter threats to peace." I mean, do you think the US is really trying to contain China?
Well, the speech was as hard as nails. My complaint was it was made in the Australian Parliament. If it had been made in Washington, fine. But the appearance of it looked as though we'd been swept up into some sort of military policy, particularly when we're announcing the small numbers running now about the sort of American troops going through Darwin. It just had all of the sort of look of that. The fact is that the United States and China will determine the shape of the Asia-Pacific, but if it's bipolar, we are all in trouble. The aim of the game is to stop that rigidity, that bipolarity, to always have the space for diplomatic flexibility, to have a concert of powers in Asia, not a balance of power in Asia, where states like China, like Japan, like the United States, like Indonesia, like India, like Australia, are all part of the governing construct of Asia and the Pacific.
But why shouldn't the US, or indeed Australia, be prepared to speak up on issues it's concerned about with China, whether it's human rights, the free press, the lack of transparency in the legal system?
Well, you can speak up about it, but can you argue that having come from abject poverty to 20% of US incomes for 1.35 billion people, that the human condition hasn't improved? I mean, I think it's shockingly arrogant of people in the West, you know, small illiberals, you know, you hear them all the time, disregarding completely the huge lift in the human condition in China. Yes, they have their problems, their democratic problems, and we're entitled to talk about them. But to condemn China, you know, the President said words to the effect that progress without democracy is another form of poverty. I think this was a very unfair remark to make about the Chinese.
Was it also a mistake for Kevin Rudd, when he was Prime Minister, to go to Beijing and give them a lecture on Tibet?
Well, I made my points clear on Tibet. I saw the Dalai Lama. The Chinese didn't like that either. But I do have regard for what they have built and how they are building it. And trying to hold that great state together, frankly, having Australian politicians up there telling them how it should be done. In practical terms, let's use that word, the Chinese government has been, in terms of the facilitation of growth and employment, the most successful in the world for 2 decades. The most successful in the world for 2 decades. Now, here we are saying, oh, no, let me tell you how to do it. The Chinese will get around to it. as middle incomes rise, people will want their say. And now, of course, with the social policy, the social outcomes via the internet and everything, they'll get it much earlier than they would have otherwise.
If they do get that access to the internet.
But surely Australia's commentary on this great state has got to be more than about what we think are our... In other words, if they'd have had a vote but remained in abject poverty, it would have been okay. Right? If they'd have had a vote but remained in abject poverty, all the people in the sort of the left would they be ticking that box? You know?
Well, you accused the Howard government of benign neglect and tokenism in its policy towards Asia. Has that changed much?
I think this government's much more focused on the region, much more focused. I think Kevin Rudd, Stephen Smith, the Prime Minister, I think they're much more focused. I mean, John Howard took us into an undeclared war in Iraq with the Americans. The Americans will walk out of Iraq with nothing. Not the new base that was going to replace Saudi Arabia. With all of their dead and all of their lost treasure, they'll walk out of it with nothing in an undeclared war. You know, you would have heard if P.J. Keating had committed Australia to an undeclared war, the Sydney Morning Herald would have been wringing its hands, the Age, the Australian, they would have been wringing their hands. But, you know, if the little conservative shellback guy does it, quiet.
What about Afghanistan? Why do you think we're really there? Is it about the US alliance? And should we still be there?
I'm sure it's about the US alliance. It's a case now of substantially diminishing returns. Now, I'm not on the ground and don't have the military intelligence that I might have otherwise had, but I'm coming to the view that it's very much a case of diminishing returns for us.
So we should get out?
I think we should get out. It's a matter of what that timing is.
After the break, I want to turn to the nature of leadership and why Paul Keating was a different sort of Prime Minister. Welcome back. It's 20 years since the Keating government took office in Australia, and we're talking this week to the former Prime Minister. Paul Keating, we've talked a lot about your achievements in government, but do you have any regrets?
Oh, we all have regrets, David. I mean, my greatest regret was I didn't stay a bit longer. I didn't, because even another 3 years would have made it completely clear that the reforms I presided over were the major motor generator of the place, and the falls in interest rates which occurred within 3 months of my leaving were all off the back of the inflation rate. We'd already broken the back of inflation. You just needed the time for the what's called inflationary expectations to settle down. And but anyway, that wasn't to be.
Why did you lose in '96?
Oh, well, I was asking for we're asking 16 years. It's 4 consecutive US presidential terms. It's a lot. And also, I did push the envelope, you know, on things like the Republic and native title. And
were you seen to be out of touch because of that?
Well, leaders who are in touch generally are not leading. You understand? If you're in touch with the lowest common denominator, look, if you're in touch with the denominator, you're following. You're following. That's what that's about. The one thing I did seriously regret is Ralph Willis announced in our last budget taking super to 15%, taking superannuation to 15%. I should have locked and loaded it in legislation, and I didn't. And of course, Howard promised to keep it and walked away from it. So we were stuck at 9 until now, and it's only the Gillard government, or the Rudd government before it, announced that they would go from 9 to 12, but we won't get there till 2019. So we lost 17 years of savings. 17 years.
But there were broken promises too, the LAW tax cuts?
Well, it wasn't a broken promise. What happened was the Treasury made estimates, forward estimates for the revenue, upon which we said we would legislate tax cuts. When the revenue fell, a serious and conscientious government makes adjustments. So what I did, I brought the first round of tax cuts forward, and I delayed by 2 years the second round, but said I'd pay them as savings, not as cash, into superannuation. So, you know, in the sort of annals of good government around the world, I would have thought that was pretty good.
But that followed the 93 election where you had railed against the GST, against this new tax that John Hewson wanted to bring in. And then the budget that followed it, you put up a lot of indirect taxes instead, and there was that deferral that you talk about. Did that break some trust with voters?
Well, I think it did, and I think it did. I think you're correct in saying that. But it was a sort of a Treasury-inspired thing. You know, they wanted to get back. I mean, you know, you always should have advice. I have to say this to ministers, you have advisors on tap but not on top. When the advisor's on top but not on tap, generally you go off the rails. And, of course, what happened there, we were trying to repair the budget balance too quickly. In fact, when we were coming out of the recession, the natural stabilisers in the budget were working to hold up the economy, paying unemployment benefits, lost tax revenue. This was all holding up the economy. To bring it back quicker to surplus was simply to injure the economy, and the Treasury should have been basically sent back to their sort of counting machines, you know.
But would that have left you with a deeper deficit? And John Howard, when he became PM, a bigger number to play with him, and he made a lot of capital out of that $8 billion deficit.
This is a whole nonsense about surpluses and deficits. Coming out of the recession, the measure of the deficit, I mean, let me make it clear that if the Howard Costello first budget had not have happened, the budget would have been back into surplus 2 years later anyway.
Because of the automatic stabilisers?
Yeah, and the economy would have been the better for it. You know, this was all just a bit of Liberal Party nonsense.
I've got to ask you then, what do you think about the current rush to get back into surplus, given the global economic problems, which you've described yourself as the worst you've seen?
Yeah, well, I think because of the global economic problems, the Treasurer is completely correct in saying that in this sea of mediocrity, Australia will be not adding to government debt by returning to structural surplus. I mean, I think there's a real point in that. Because in terms of holding up the Australian economy doesn't need to be held up. It's growing around 3%. You know, the circumstances of the debate about surplus and deficit now is not like 1995 or 96. In 1995 or 96, the fact that the budget was in modest deficit helped the country, you know. Whereas now, if it's left in moderate deficit in this, you know, these shocking markets around the world now, I mean, I think Wayne Swan judged this one completely right.
I want to ask you about the nature of leadership. Unlike most Australian leaders, you proudly wore your love of the arts, whether it was music, fine arts, architecture, even French clocks. You talk about your ideas coming from...
It wasn't French clocks, it was my interest in the art and architecture of the second half of the 18th century, all of it.
All of it, not just
all of
clocks.
it.
Okay.
Particularly in the revolutionary years coming up to the French Revolution, which made the modern political age. But trying to tell that to the numbskulls of the Canberra Press Gallery, I mean, firstly, they barely wonder what the revolutionary years would be, you know. They wouldn't have understood the impact of the philosophers upon the French Revolution, you know.
I'm sure that's largely right.
So therefore, someone saw me carrying a small clock home in a plane and they made me a clock collector forever.
Nonetheless, a lot of Australians would probably wonder about those things too.
I'll just tell you about the arts and the culture. Most Australian leaders were not as interested as I was because they've never had an emotional event with the arts. A truly emotional event. In other words, if you hand yourself over to the arts, particularly music, but in other forms of art, your mind opens up. There's another realm outside the temporal realm. But if you're talking to somebody who only takes the cabinet papers home of a night, goes to their motel room, reads the cabinet papers and gets up with the newspapers, you're wasting your breath and your energy trying to tell them how important the arts are. But they're important to me. I mean, I often say to people, and you've seen me say, the Australian economy was reformed off the back of Gustav Mahler, Anton Bruckner and Mr. Shostakovich. But it's completely true.
How long would you spend each evening, for example, listening?
Depends what it was, what mood took me. You know, I might have a sort of cello concerto on, or some songs by Schubert or something, or if I went bigger, you know, it was like a Bruckner symphony or something. I mean, I'd walk out of those things. I remember Michelle Grattan asked me one time, just before a budget, she said, what'd you do this morning, Treasurer? And I said, well, I was actually listening to Richard Strauss's last 4 songs. She said, what? What is this? You see, if you get the expansion running, if you get the imagination moving on the big plane, the cabinet material are just cracks in the floorboards of history, dust in the cracks of the floorboards of history. You know, you can go across the stuff easily in a much bigger, more confident way if you let the geniuses play with your head.
It's probably some good advice to the current crop of politicians. Do you think any of them get that?
Well, you've got to take... This is all about time, particularly with music. You know, music is the greatest form of the arts, and you've got to give it time. You can't listen to this work washing up the dishes or reading a cabinet submission. You've got to listen. But it promotes... It's a massive promoter of imagination. And I used to always have the pad beside me if I was hearing me to write things down I was thinking of as they were coming, you know. So it's meant a lot to me. And I believe the arts are central to a nation. You know, they hold the mirror up to the country. They sort of define what we are and what we've become. And those people who think, oh, well, it's good to look arty and turn up at an art show, it's a great pity because they're missing the main point. But they're missing it personally.
You've talked about the need for leaders to lead, not follow, the need for them to be inspired through the arts as well. Is Julia Gillard a good leader?
Well, I'm not here to score Julia. She won't appreciate me doing that. I'm saying the obvious to say you can't win an election with 30% of the vote. I lost with 39. Bob Hawke won with 39.2 in 1990, you know. You can't win a national election in Australia without a 4 in front of the primary number. The Labor Party's got to get to 40, 41 or 42 to win. You can't win from 39 backing it up with preferences. So the definite answer to your question is Julia Gillard a good leader, will be whether she can turn the 3-0 into the 4-0.
Do you think Kevin Rudd would do any better?
Oh, I'm not. How would we know? I mean, the public have a view about Kevin Rudd. Some will be a complimentary view, and others it won't be. It'll be a detrimental view, a detracting view. Where the balance of all that falls out after the events of, you know, a couple of years ago, I wouldn't know.
You think he was a good Prime Minister, though, in the time that he had?
Well, he's got the great achievement of dragging Australia through that shocking crisis in 07, 08. And, you know, the Liberal Party put that away. You know, I notice that fool Hockey still running around saying, oh, they wasted money. I mean, only a arrant fool would say such a thing. It was because of the fiscal pull of the lever and the change in Australia got saved, for God's sake, you know. The whole world acknowledged it. The IMF acknowledged it. The OEC acknowledged it, but not the Liberal Party, not the Lilliputians of the Liberal Party of Australia. You know, so you've got to give Kevin Rudd that credit, clear as day, and on that big matter.
Finally, I want to ask you about former Prime Ministers. In the United States, former presidents are often used in many ways on policy matters, international diplomacy and the like. Yeah. What about here in Australia? Do we do enough with our former Prime Ministers?
We don't do anything with former Prime Ministers, but I'm a bit sympathetic with that view, actually. I mean, you go and do your own things. That's what I do. I mean, I don't want to sort of tag along as some sort of paid government person, you know.
But if the government of the day came to you and asked you to take on a significant role representing Australia or doing...
Well, I'd think about it. But it'd have to be good. It would have to be something that I'm interested in. And none of them, neither the Howard nor the Rudd government or the Gillard government ever has. So I don't have the problem of deciding that, David. No one's made me the offers. But frankly, they don't run it. None of them have run a ship of the kind I would run. So therefore, you know, oil and water, not necessarily a good mix.
Just finally then, looking back 20 years at the Keating government, how does the Keating government compare to other governments we've seen in Australia?
Well, it did the big reforms of product markets by all the tariff cuts, seeing them into place and watching that tariff rate drop down in the middle and back of a recession. That big reform of the product markets and the huge once-in-a-100-year reform to the labour market, which was the abolition of centralised wage fixing for bargaining, the building of Australia's super pool, superannuation, Australia seeing the great post-war opportunity in the Pacific, the linkages to Indonesia and to China, and of course native title and the thing that didn't happen, the Republic. In 4 years, this is a lot, you know. Very few governments in Australia's 20th century did more in 4 years.
Paul Keating, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, that's our program for this week and for the year. Do have a safe and happy holiday. We'll see you in 2012.